Hi everyone, my name is Mr. Theodore Dancier Rivero, and this is Oral Communication. And in this subject, we're gonna be learning all about communication, maybe verbal, nonverbal, and all those different types of communication. We always say that communication is everywhere. When we go to a comfort room, when we see signs, when we talk to someone, when we text someone, when we're composing a tweet, or maybe just shaking hands with someone, bowing our heads, or nodding, or even waving our hands to someone. Those are all different types or ways on how we communicate. So in this video, we're going to be discussing mostly about the functions of communication and also the nature of communication. So how does communication come about? How does someone talk to someone and know that they're actually communicating? Do we need only one person, two persons, three persons? Or do we need like a whole class of people to consider it as communication? We're going to be knowing more on that later on. So first things first, we're going to be discussing the nature of communication. It says here that communication is a message understood. Of course, we all send messages, right? We always post tweets, you always say something. But the communication does not stop there. It should always be from the second party or the second person to actually understand what you're saying. And that's when the actual communication is occurring. Because you can say anything you want, you can nod at everyone, you can just say hi to everyone, but if the one that you're talking to or the one that you're communicating with does not understand what you're saying, the communication really is not there. Because if the receiver does not understand the message, we already have that miscommunication. Miscommunication occurs when the message is not clear. Miscommunication occurs when there is something that stops the message to be given to the receiver. For example, if you remember from your grade 9 lessons, Romeo and Juliet were communicating through mail, right? So the friar had a plan that Juliet will have this like fake sleep and then Romeo will know about it through mail. But the problem was that the messenger boy failed to send or to give the message to Romeo, hence him committing suicide because he didn't know anything about the plan between Friar and Juliet. If there's miscommunication, that's the worst case scenario, Romeo and Juliet, but of course, it's essential for communication to occur if the message is understood by the receiver. Number 2, communication is social interaction through messages. Yes, it should be a social interaction, meaning just like the cliche, no one is an island. And that's the same thing with communication. You cannot communicate with yourself. You cannot communicate just by thinking with yourself, like you're nodding with yourself or you're tweeting with yourself. There's no communication there because there should always be a receiver of that message. Most often times be feedback, because without the receiver or the feedback, then communication does not occur. It can be 1-to-1, it can also be 1-to-2, or 1 to anyone, or 1 to many. But make sure that you're not talking to yourself because that's not communication. Sociology says that without social interaction, a society cannot survive, and that's absolutely correct. Just like what sociology says, in communication cannot occur without someone else. It's like a two-way street. You say something, someone listens, and then someone says something back. That's how we communicate. It's not like you're gonna be saying, it's not like tweeting, because in Twitter, right, if you know the concept of Twitter, It's not every time that you tweet, someone will say something back. Like the concept of tutor is like you're saying something in an empty room, because it doesn't matter if someone responds to you or not. That your tweets are just there, are just messages that you just want to give out in the world, and you don't care if someone replies or not, right? Because that's your tweet. I mean, that's the concept of Twitter. So yeah, that's basically it with the nature of communication. And yes, it is our nature to communicate. Of course, psychology says that we have two different types of people. We have introverts and extroverts, but still, those are personalities that communicate differently. Someone would want to communicate through his art, his fashion, his music, etc. Someone will also want to communicate through talking, through mingling with others, social interacting, etc. And I do think that communication is one of the key ingredients to a successful community, because without communication we cannot be functioning well as a well-rounded society. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's nature of communication. Now we move on to the communication process. So in the communication process, there are some elements that we need to understand first before we understand the whole entire process. So the communication process is very similar to what we've learned in science, that we have a stimulus and a response. The stimulus being the sender of the message, while this response is the feedback coming from the receiver. So in the process of communication, we begin with a stimulus. There's always a reason why the sender wants to say something to you or tell you something. That's the stimulus. And from that stimulus, the sender wants to relay a message to the receiver, of course, through different channels. It may be through phone, through call, through text, same thing, through tweeting, through Facebook, etc. And then the receiver tries to, of course, understand what that encoded message means. May it be anything. Then the receiver, after understanding what the sender is saying, the receiver will eventually reply back to the sender, and that's the feedback. But sometimes, of course, we also have, like we've said earlier, we have miscommunication, and that occurs when there are barriers of communication. Barriers are these things that stop or hinder us from communicating with the other party or the receiver. May it be a bad signal, may it be, just like in Romeo and Juliet's case, wrong time, wrong place, may it be an unclear message, maybe like your voice is, it can also be like emotion or etc. Like if you're really angry, whatever input you get becomes negative, right? If you're angry. So those are just some types of barriers of communication, which we will be discussing in the next lessons. So that's basically it. That's basically what the process of communication is. It's basically playing, it's like the Filipino game pass the message, right? Like there's one person who will pass the message that will be your sender, and then the message will be sent through like tapping on the wrists, I think, and until the sender gets back another tap or like a feedback, and then he or she will eventually say, I get the message, which means he or she already receives the feedback from the different people who got her or his message. Moving on, we also have different functions of communication. Just like what we've discussed earlier, we have a stimulus. The sender always has a reason why he or she is sending the message. It's not just any random thing that he wants to say or do or to communicate, but there's always a reason. It can be to teach, to entertain, to ask a question. It can also be to, just to greet, to let you know, to inform, etc. And there are many types of functions of communication. So that's it for today's lesson. Just to have a rundown of what we discussed the nature of communication, the process of communication, and some functions of communication. These will be discussed more thoroughly throughout the next lessons. Just like the cliche that I've said earlier, no one is an island. So make sure to talk to someone, to communicate, and always give feedback. Thank you and have a great day.